Hi everyone, this is our first session from the book club. Today we will be discussing the book The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. So in this we will discuss the world's/Italy's history during the Renaissance period, which goes from the 14th up to 17th century. We will have an overview of the book, The Prince, and how it's viewed by different people. And lastly, we will shed light on Niccolò Machiavelli's personality and delve into his life and reasons for writing the book.
Yeah, so this is just an overall view on what's happened. So basically, this book has been written the Renaissance period. So this comes to us from the literature, if you like, in that period. It's quite a controversial book. And one of the reasons, like I found it interesting in the research, that Machiavelli has sort of a pragmatic approach into how he's trying to be realistic rather than being idealist, stating how life should be. Instead, he's saying like, this is the reality and this is how we can deal with it, being practical. So I found in my readings, I found this quote. This is from Machiavelli himself. And this is for those people who think Machiavelli, for example, being a traitor or trying to be a hypocrite, for example. In my opinion, this explains it all. So he says, if I have been a little too punctual in describing these quote-unquote monsters, he's basically talking about the rulers of the time or the princes of the time. So if I've been a little too punctual in describing these monsters in all their lineaments and colors, I hope mankind will know them, the better to avoid them, and my treatise, which is The Prince, being both a satire against them and a true character of them. So that's just to give you an idea of his approach and what approach or what mentality he had when he was writing the book. Now, this is just a very brief overview of The Prince. It's sort of divided into two sections. The first section would sort of talk about the types of principalities and would mention some examples from history and to sort of get the practicality of it and seeing it in practice, how they are different. And then he would sort of discuss means of acquiring like a principality, and he would discuss both moral and immoral. And as we said before, he doesn't discuss it in an ideal way in how it should be, but he just discusses it the way how it's been, so discussing the reality. And then he would move on and talks about the types of armies, the benefits, pros and cons, and with the different types of armies, and then the duties of the prince and the duties of the military, if you like. Then you will see the theme of the book will change in the second section. And then he will talk about addressing the qualities of the prince and how to govern, things like how to choose his ministers or his close circle, if you like, and advisors. And toward the end, he will talk about the prudence of the prince and giving more towards the end, giving a universal idea and universal look, how the prince should aim for, basically for the better of Italy. And then I found this interesting quote that I thought to share it with you. It's by James Burnham. This is a person who, it's a commenter. He written a book, a commentary, if you like, about The Prince, about Machiavelli. So he's saying, since Machiavelli is neither a propagandist nor an apologist, because you will see that in his book, he would sort of basically say, like, when he states, you know, a bit of a heavy fact, if you like, he doesn't apologize and say, look, I'm not going to beautify this book for you. I'll state the facts as it is. So, since he's not in the demagogue of any party or sect or group, he knows, and he says how hypocritical are the calls of a unity that is a mask for suppression of all opposition. How fatally and lying or wrong are all beliefs that liberty is a peculiar attribute of any single individual or group, prince, democrat, nobles, or people or multitude.
A lot of commentaries, I think, that commented on the book. If you go like on YouTube and check the videos, especially like some authors and stuff, some are really against him and call him as like a monster, or like bringing down rulers and stuff like that, which is not true facts. And some are completely with him, and the way he described all these rulers and all these princes and stuff. So I guess everyone that reads the book has their own opinion about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this James Burnham guy, he's like he's being realistic, and it is sort of showing how much Machiavelli being misunderstood. And also, just to adding to the point that Said has mentioned, even the word Machiavellian has originated after his book, and how his book has been prohibited in the church until like I can't remember. I think it's in 1535 or something. And then like when it was first printed and it was translated into English, and sort of the rulers or the princes of the time started to using it. So that's the overview.
Zain, do you want to take it away from here?
Yeah. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum. So firstly, we'll be starting, so this kind of segment will be split into first a bit of background on Italy and Europe's kind of history, and then afterwards some more pointers on what were the happenings of the world, I guess, at that time. So first, we'll just quickly next. So first, one important thing to establish first, Italy was split into a series of warring states, and this is also the same kind of, the rest of the world was in a very similar position. Like it wasn't that there were set countries or that, like there was land agreements, but there were always warring states. And they, were known to have like many wars, as we'll later discuss. And the kind of, and that was made up of like a lot of different republics and principalities. And then here's a list of some of the most important and influential of the states. So Milan, Florence. So background history. So Europe was obviously a region of great conflict during the 15th century and prior to it. But the major conflicts kind of began in Italy following the French invasion of 1494.
In terms of the French invasion, what encouraged it was the fact that Venice wanted to split. The Republic wanted to form its strong independence from the Papal States, and it invited France over to help it out. And so that gave France a grasp on Italian soil.
And Italy was already kind of a big, I guess, a melting pot for different ideas and cultures, which mostly because it acted as a world, kind of a bridge between the rest of Europe and the more kind of Islamic world, which was, ruled by the Ottomans at the time. And they were in that period, kind of in the last, I think 400 years was the Ottomans kind of their reign. And then that was kind of superseded by the kind of the Western's domination, if you want to put it like that.
But you still had the Andalus in Spain, which wasn't touched by the Ottomans. However, that was completely dismantled around this period by Ferdinand and his wife Isabella when they started the Spanish Inquisition and pretty much kicked out or killed all the Muslims and Jews that were living there at the time.
Yeah.
And then this is kind of where we get into the specific examples, which are discussed more and a bit more by Machiavelli in The Prince. So talking about, how Charles VIII formed an alliance with, the Holy Roman Emperor. And that kind of was the, not the beginning of, but one of the kind of first events of the Italian Wars, warring in Italy. Yeah. So then after that, in 1499, Louis the 12th of France invaded Italy, and he took Milan, which is kind of on the northern side, and that gives him reach to Venice and then some of the more southern states. And then also from there he moved on to Genoa and Naples, but then later on was driven out by Ferdinand of Spain, who Mariam mentioned before. So then following that, the 10th of December in 1508, the League of Cambria was formed by Pope Julius II, which brought together a lot more of the smaller states. So including, France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Ferdinand. And their kind of aim was to kind of take over Venice, because Venice held a lot of the power at the time, and was preventing them from a lot of like not only trade opportunities, but they're like kind of on the more economic side of things. They did fail in that kind of pursuit, and I think that kind of alliance is discussed a little bit in Machiavelli's texts, mostly with the idea of, and if it's not, then it is very closely related, but the idea of more powerful nations, and that being sided with by smaller ones, which is kind of pushed against, or it doesn't encourage it. So those wars continued up until 1525, the Italy Wars. Yeah, they kind of ended in 1525, but they were officially declared as over in 1559 with the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis Agreement.
Yeah, I mean, these events were after the publishing or the writing of the Prince. But it's important to know the events which were after, because a lot of them were influenced by this book.
And now just a little bit more on the Renaissance period, which isn't really directly related to Machiavelli's texts, but is more to do with kind of, I guess, the ideas at the time that were kind of coming together. And yeah, so it took place between the 14th and 17th century. Some people say it starts a bit earlier, but it's usually agreed upon at that date. And then that kind of, it's established a lot of the kind of groundwork for what was going to become, I guess, the modern world at that point, with a lot of, great thinkers, such as, Leonardo da Vinci, as well as a lot of artists like, Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, and then as well as other astronomers, Galileo, as well as many others, and then of course William Shakespeare. And this period directly superseded the Islamic Golden Age, which ended in the 14th century. And they were kind of able to, because through Venice, they already had like a lot of like trade connections and all that. Those two worlds kind of came together, and that kind of had a pretty major influence in how Europe was developed at the time, along with the Renaissance period and with the technologies and the scripture and all that.
Yeah.
And I think next.
Also, a lot of ancient forms from China came as well with Marco Polo.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then this is kind of a very brief kind of world history to kind of go over what was happening at the time, maybe some more important dates that give a bit of a scope as to what was kind of happening. 1500, first helicopter designed by Leonardo da Vinci, I believe. 1506, death of Christopher Columbus, who discovered the Americas. Discovered it in the Western sense, but yeah. So then 1513, yeah. And then 1513, discovery of the Pacific Ocean, which is on the other side. Death of Leonardo da Vinci, 1519, which is only 19 years after he designed the helicopter. An interesting one that I found out that I didn't know anything about was 1539 with the first authorized English Bible, which would have been, I think, quite influential at the time, even politically, because the church was still strong back then.
Yep. I've read that the first Bible which was transferred to English is the one that Martin Luther wrote, and not the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Yeah. And then death of King Henry VIII, who's kind of, I think, one of the more famous of the King Henrys. So, okay, so then between 1547 and 53, so that 6-year period, that was kind of a transition stage where England eventually became a Protestant state, which is the current form of Christianity observed in most parts of the world. And then 1553 to 58, Queen Mary was crowned the Queen of England. Her reign only lasted 5 years. So after that, Queen Elizabeth became the Queen of England. And 1564, William Shakespeare was born, so he kind of was in the latter end of the Renaissance period. And then 1588, Spanish Armada, which was defeated by the English.
All right, now we shall pass it on to Sister Mariam.
The important thing before we delve into this book is to understand who the author is, the reasons why he wrote it, and what kind of background he has or authority to make such bold claims. So we'll start off from his childhood. Machiavelli was born into a family of lawyers. And so this had multiple consequences on his life, but the two major ones that we're going to focus on was that because of his status in society, of the family in society as lawyers, he was well off. He wasn't from the poor or the middle class of Florence at the time. And that afforded him the luxury to go to the University of Florence and to have a proper education in ethics, surprisingly, in Latin, and his favorite subject, history. And he also studied all the arts at the time, but they were kind of a convoluted mixture of a subject. The second important thing is that because these states were kind of ruled by the families that were that had the most power, the most authority, the people that usually came to lawyers were the people who had or wanted some form of justice and reform by the system. So wherever they ended up, they were always on the opposite side of whoever was ruling Florence at the time. But it also allowed him the opportunity to see how the working class worked. The poor and the middle class, he had a new perspective or a different perspective because he had to live with them to be able to, inherit the business if that's what he wanted to do when he grew up. And at the same time, he lived the upper class life. So that also helps because when we read this book, we'll understand that he actually had some form of understanding of what the working class believed in and felt about the ruler at the time. It was during the high prime of the Renaissance, and at the time of Florence was taken by the Medici family. And they are very famous for, spending a lot of their wealth on trying to increase the art, the education of the city and that kind of thing. They spent huge amounts of money on parties and trying to satisfy the people materially. And that's why nobody really wanted to kick them out until a priest came to them by the name of Girolamo Savonarola. And he told the people of Florence, who were naive because all they did their entire life was follow instructions, that he was the prophet of God and that all that they were doing was against the Bible. And what he also had, which nobody really knows up to now how he acquired this information, was all the hidden messages and the murders that the Medici had done undercover. He kind of unearthed them all. And so people realized that, the Medici, they're not as perfect as they seem. And they felt impure and wanted to purge what had happened to the city, and they got rid of the Medici. And this is when the Republic of Florence was at its peak. Machiavelli, if you read his other book that he wrote, The Discussion of Levies, you'll know he's in love with republics. When it came to forming the Republic of Florence, he was instated as the second chancellor of the state, which meant he wrote all the official government documents. And so the government of the city decided to ensure that no new family could take all the power of Florence, that they created a new council called the 10 of Liberty and Peace. And every few months, the 10 members which were involved in that council would be changed so that the council would represent the people and they would also carry out the people's will. Surprisingly, although they change every few months, Machiavelli stayed in his position as the secretary for 14 years, which meant that the people were satisfied with his services. It gave him the ability to travel, to look at other principalities, other republics, and how they were running themselves. And he also gave advice to others, whether this was proper advice or whether it was deceitful advice for his own cause. Another thing he really did was form the army for Florence. Before, Florence depended on mercenaries, and he decided that it was important to form their own army out of civilians, and he instated that. One of the people that he mentions a lot in The Prince because he accompanied this person a lot, is Shazari Borja. And a lot of the controversy around the prince comes from the examples he gives in the prince, especially this person. So the Borgia family are heinous criminals of the Renaissance. And Cesare is pretty bad. His father was the Pope at the time, and he was the head of the papal armies. And so Machiavelli had to kind of follow him around. However, after his father died, a new Pope had to come into place. And Cesare was sick during the elections, so he couldn't pay off the other cardinals to vote for someone who would benefit him. And so Pope Julius II came into power instead. And the problem with Julius II is he is best friends with the Medici. So as soon as Pope Alexander VI was taken out, the Medici were reinstated back to Florence through papal force. And that meant that Machiavelli was going to be captured and tortured for heresy against the Medici. After 4 days being tortured, he was released because there was no evidence to convict him against the Medici, but they still found him a threat, so they exiled him. And it was during his time in exile that he wrote The Prince. And The Prince was a letter dedicated to the new Medici ruler. He is the enemy of the Medici. Why is he helping him now? I mean, it's kind of the opposite of what he says in his book, and we'll find that out, inshallah. So a lot of people thought that he was doing this as a form of job application, that he was writing this to prove to the Medici that he has the skills and he wants to go back to Florence and get his old job back. So selfish reasoning. Other people, upon reading The Prince, because of the tone of his final chapter, believe because he loved Republic so much and he loved his home, that he was doing it out of desperation to try and save Florence. That he cared not who the ruler was, but that the things that he had established be kept the same. But that still is very conflicting because he's very flattering in the way that he approaches the Medici. But the rest of the tone of the book is very harsh and, straight to the point. As Hanin said, he's not apologetic about everything. So what could be the reasoning behind it or why he wrote it? There are many theories about why he wrote this book, and some of them are that he never actually meant it for the Medici. Because at the time when the Medici were reinstated, there was a lot of rebellion against them. Weak, but it still existed. If Machiavelli never liked the Medici, perhaps he was trying to persuade or give information to the people against them of their methods and the way that they rule so that they would understand them better. I mean, intercepting letters or even the councils around the Medici were very much against them. So that is a very high possibility. But in general, when we have to look at it, this book wasn't meant to be taken literally at all. It was meant as a way to expose what princes do. What he writes is true. This is how princes rule. And the reason why we say this is because Machiavelli has transformed the way that people look at history. He's kind of like the Ibn Khaldun of the Renaissance, if you like.
Yeah.
What he did was not look at history as stories, but took lessons and kind of conceptualized how things were made and how things happened in history. It's a very, very practical approach of how to analyze and look at the past and how to then, use it in the future. It wasn't meant to be taken word to word. Unfortunately, a lot of people who don't read it properly or, skip the intro that he writes, they don't really look at that. And so what we need to do is understand The Prince is a practical book and not an idealistic book. He's not talking about morals and how life should be like the Communist Manifesto, but it's very practical. And that's why it was successful, unlike the Communist Manifesto. What we need to do when we approach this book is not look at it at a practical side either. We need to look at it at a more holistic view. Because in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the fight of humanity is between two forces, Bani Adam and the Shaitan, the good and the bad. And if we use this to look at this book, we're going to see everything in a different light, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, though, we'll jump into chapter 1, and Noor has a little piece about the political commentary that he gives.
Yeah, so what I did was I read the first chapter and I just thought that there's a lot of introductory political theory that he introduces, especially regarding principalities. So he definitely is a big fan of republics, but he distinguishes from the beginning that in chapter 1 that he's not going to discuss republics, and he's more examining principalities and how they may be acquired. But in the first chapter, he's only talking about the types of principalities, and that's that they're either new or inherited. So new principalities, which are, so he states that they're either annexed to a ruler's existing territory, so acquiring it as a part of his original territory, or a completely new territory. And they can either be used, the new principalities are acquired, he says, by luck or by sheer strength. So, and he says that they can always cause problems for the prince and that they can be a bit hard for him to acquire. So in a scale of hard to easy in the means of acquisition, he claims that new principalities are hard because they're either built by luck or incrementally by skill. And so the other principality he states are hereditary principalities, and they're the ones that are being ruled by the prince's family, so through inheritance. And he claims that they're easy to maintain because the tradition keeps the prince's position stable as long as he does not make himself hated by the people. So he encourages rulers to approach governments with a combination of tradition, which is inherited, but also by adapting. And he urges these principles to be built on institutional foundations to keep the state secure, but at the same time advises them to adapt policies to the times that they're in. And that's why skilled rulers should seek a middle ground between the aspect of tradition and change, which I found was really interesting. He also says that they're easier to rule than new states, as tradition provides for that basis of the stable government, which is always oftentimes hard to acquire. He argues in a key point that, in a quote, and in the antiquity and continuity of the government, he writes, people forget not only the reasons for innovations, but their very existence, because every new change provides a footing to build on another. And that was also a really interesting quote. That's pretty much his introduction to the first section of the book. As Hanin said, there's two kind of distinct sections.
Yeah, so thank you for all joining us for our first session on commentary on The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Today basically was an introduction to give everybody a understanding of the happenings of the time and the events and personal life which may have led Machiavelli to write this book, and a brief summary of what to expect in the future, inshallah, and a great summary of chapter 1. In our next session, we will be looking at chapter 2 and chapter 3 specifically, which are going to be hereditary and mixed principalities. We hope to see you all next week, inshallah.